The first thing you notice is the absolute quiet, an almost sacred stillness that wraps itself around you as your view begins to drift through a thick ocean of golden clouds. There is no wind, no rush, no sense of urgency, only a soft, slow drift, as if the sky itself is holding its breath. The colors shift from amber to pearl, each cloud catching the sunlight in a way that feels unreal, like the glow inside a dream that you're somehow consciously walking through. As you move forward, the mist thins, revealing a massive shape suspended in the heavens. A floating continent, majestic and impossibly still, drifting with the grace of something alive rather than something made of stone. The edges of this suspended world rise like colossal cliffs carved by forces older than time, yet the surface looks untouched, smooth, expansive, and illuminated by a light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The silence deepens as you approach, becoming almost hypnotic, like a warm weight gently pressing on your senses, encouraging you to breathe slower, to observe more carefully, to surrender to the surreal calm of this floating realm. As the ground nears, the texture of the stone becomes visible, patterns etched naturally by centuries of wind currents that could not possibly exist so high in the sky. Small particles of light drift upward, shimmering like dust caught in a sunbeam, except there is no direct sun above you, only the diffuse glow that blankets this entire world. Nothing feels chaotic here. Everything is smooth, soft, intentional. Even the shadows behave differently, melting into gradients rather than sharp contrasts, as if the continent refuses to allow anything harsh to exist within its boundaries. When your feet finally touch the surface, there is no impact. It feels lighter than it should, almost buoyant, as though the stone itself absorbs part of your weight and holds you gently. In every direction, the island stretches out in vast plains, gentle slopes and distant ridges that vanish into the glowing mist. The sky around you is not truly blue, not fully at least. It shifts subtly, like a canvas constantly repainted by an invisible hand. Everything is too quiet, too ordered, too serene, and yet deeply inviting. You feel something in your chest loosen, a tension you didn't even realize you were carrying. For a moment, you're not just visiting this place, you're being welcomed by it. The air tastes clean, almost sweet, carrying the faint scent of minerals and morning dew. The world below the clouds no longer feels real. Up here, in this elevated silence, time stretches and softens, and the first thought that enters your mind is a simple one. You were not meant to find this place so easily. But now that you're here, the floating continent seems to acknowledge your presence, as if it's been waiting, quietly, patiently, for someone to arrive who would truly notice the things most people overlook. You take your first step forward, and the sound is barely a whisper. The stone does not echo, it absorbs, it calms. And with each breath you take, the sky around you brightens slightly, as if responding to your curiosity. At this moment, even before you learn anything about the people who live here, or the rule that governs their entire existence, you already feel the gentle pull of a world balanced on something delicate, something both beautiful and fragile, something that seems to float not only above the clouds, but above the ordinary world entirely. As you begin to walk further into this skybound world, the sensation beneath your feet becomes even more surreal, as though each step is cushioned by invisible currents, gently lifting the ground itself. The stone feels warm, not hot, but naturally heated, like something that has absorbed light for centuries and slowly releases it in a comforting glow. The light sources around you are impossible to pinpoint. The sky above is bright, yet there is no defined sun, no clear direction from which illumination pours. Instead, the air itself seems to shimmer with a soft radiance that fills every corner of the floating continent, erasing harsh shadows and blending the horizon into a seamless gradient of pale gold and silver. It's the kind of light that feels kind to the eyes, the sort that makes colors appear softer, edges smoother, and movement gentler. For a moment you feel weightless, not because gravity is absent, but because it seems softened, as if this place has learned to negotiate with it rather than obey its full force. You inhale deeply, and the air enters your lungs with a purity you've never experienced, thin but invigorating, almost like breathing a higher form of oxygen. There's an underlying hum, low and steady, vibrating through the soles of your feet, a pulse so faint you might mistake it for your own heartbeat syncing with the continent's rhythm. Every detail around you seems meticulously placed yet untouched by human hands. The smooth curves of the rocky pathways, the way the mist hugs the distant ridges, the delicate way the clouds below drift in slow, spiraling currents. It's a world that behaves as if under a silent agreement to remain calm, balanced, perfectly measured. But as you continue, a subtle awareness settles over you, a quiet tension woven into the tranquility. Something here is too symmetrical, too thoughtful, too aligned. It's as if the environment is designed to keep everything in equilibrium. Every gust of wind calculated, every shift in temperature intentional. The ground doesn't simply exist, it responds. When you slow your pace, the hum beneath you softens. When you breathe more deeply, the faint shimmer in the air seems to brighten slightly. You begin to realize that the peace you feel isn't merely a feature of this place. It's a mechanism, a constant, quiet regulation meant to maintain the island's stability. And yet, nothing feels mechanical or artificial. It feels organic, as if this entire continent has grown accustomed to surviving through harmony rather than force. Even the breeze carries a measured cadence, brushing past you in slow, deliberate currents that never push or pull too hard. You notice the clouds below shifting in spirals that match the island's rhythm, as if everything in this world is part of a single, synchronized breath. And still, beneath the serene surface, there's a trace of something else, a faint sense of design, of intention. The tranquility is so absolute that it becomes suspicious. No natural world is this orderly. No open sky feels this controlled. Every detail seems placed with care, every movement carefully balanced. You find yourself glancing around, searching for the source of this invisible orchestration, wondering if the continent is watching you the same way you're observing it. The longer you remain in this peaceful stillness, the more you sense the edges of a truth waiting beneath it. The idea that something here is being managed, something delicate, something that cannot, under any circumstances, be disturbed. As you move deeper into the floating continent, the first signs of civilization begin to reveal themselves. Subtle at first, almost hesitant, as if the inhabitants prefer to merge gently into the environment rather than dominate it. Small dwellings emerge near the cliffs, their structures built from the same pale stone that forms the ground beneath your feet. They appear carved rather than constructed, as though the inhabitants shaped the rock by guiding its natural tendencies instead of cutting it apart. The homes curve softly, with rounded corners and sweeping arches that echo the contours of the sky above, blending seamlessly into the landscape. Some buildings cling to the very edges of the floating cliffs, supported by delicate-looking platforms that sway gently in the breeze, yet never seem threatened by the height. You notice the way walkways extend from one outcrop to another, not rigid bridges, but airy platforms that respond subtly to the wind, shifting their balance in an elegant dance that somehow remains perfectly stable. The people themselves move with a similar grace. Slow steps, unhurried gestures, voices that rise only as whispers against the vast silence of the sky. Their clothing flows like the wind, made of soft fibers in shades of white, grey, and muted blue, blending them almost seamlessly into the luminous atmosphere around them. When two inhabitants pass each other, they exchange small nods, warm, serene acknowledgements rather than hurried greetings. There is no sense of rush, no deadlines, no visible signs of stress or urgency. Markets hover like gentle terraces, suspended by unseen forces a few feet above the ground. You watch as goods float in trays made of woven material, drifting from one vendor to another with the help of subtle wind currents that seem intentionally guided. Fruits unlike any found on Earth are displayed, softly glowing, covered in a faint mist, pulsing as though they contain tiny reservoirs of stored light. Craftsmen shape stone, wood, and metal with movements that appear almost ritualistic, as if creation is as much an act of meditation as it is of practicality. Children run without fear near the cliff's edges, their laughter carried lightly by the breeze, trusting the invisible balance that sustains this entire world. There is a profound harmony between the inhabitants and their environment, a shared understanding that everything here operates under a delicate equilibrium. You notice that even their speech patterns reflect this calm. They talk slowly, choosing words with intention, their conversations flowing like gentle streams rather than sharp exchanges. Every action, every decision seems guided by a communal awareness that nothing should create disturbance, that life itself depends on maintaining an unbroken sense of order. Food is prepared on open stone slabs, warmed naturally by the ambient light. Meals are shared in communal spaces that overlook the endless sea of clouds below. The inhabitants eat quietly, savoring each bite with a reverence that suggests gratitude not only for sustenance, but for the stability of the world they live in. Even their festivals, small gatherings marked by soft music played on wind instruments, feel more like acts of remembrance than celebrations. And throughout all of this, the markets, the meals, the daily routines, you sense an undercurrent of behavior that is almost too consistent. They all avoid turning their attention toward the same distant area. They walk around it, not directly but naturally, as if their bodies are trained to circumvent that direction without conscious thought. Their eyes linger everywhere except there. Life here is peaceful, yes, remarkably so, but that peace feels curated, maintained with delicate precision. And though the inhabitants wear calm expressions, something in their guarded glances reveals that their tranquility is not just a way of life, but a necessity for survival. Their habits, their routines, even the softness of their voices seem to be part of something larger, a cultural choreography built around a hidden truth, a truth no one dares to speak aloud. As you continue your quiet exploration of this skyborne world, the subtle oddity you sensed earlier begins to crystallize into something more defined, something that feels out of place, not because it is dramatic or obvious, but because of how meticulously everything else seems designed to avoid it. At first, it's nothing more than a shift in foot traffic, people instinctively taking longer routes around a particular region of the floating continent. You notice how their steps never drift in that direction, how their conversations soften when they pass near the invisible boundary, how even the playful children, who moments ago ran freely along the edges of cliffs without fear, become suddenly composed and purposeful, sticking close to the adults. The behavior is so uniform, so subtly ingrained, that it can only be the result of something ancient, something woven deeply into the collective consciousness of these inhabitants. When you pattern the flow of the movement across the terrain, you realize that the avoided area isn't marked by walls, fences, or warnings. There are no signs, no guards, no physical cues whatsoever. Yet the people seem to navigate around it with near-perfect instinct, as if guided by an invisible map they're all born knowing. You pause at a market terrace and watch as a vendor gently turns her stall ever so slightly, positioning its open side away from that direction, though there is no sun to avoid and no wind interfering. Another vendor arranges his goods in a pattern that subtly blocks any line of sight toward the same zone. Even the floating trays of fruits seem to drift with deliberate caution, as though the air currents themselves are participating in the avoidance. You begin to feel the weight of an unspoken rule, a behavioral boundary that has been carved into the culture, not through force or enforcement, but through shared understanding. Still, your curiosity pulls you forward, your attention drawn to the way the landscape itself subtly shifts as you move closer. The ground becomes smoother, the hum beneath your feet quieter, as if the island is holding its breath. The ambient light dims by a fraction, not enough to create darkness, but enough to create uncertainty. Colors seem less vibrant, shapes slightly blurred, not in a supernatural way, but more like the sensation of walking into a room where someone was just discussing something they didn't want you to hear. Even the air changes. It's cooler here, sharper, carrying a thin, almost metallic taste. It's not uncomfortable, just different, a break in the rhythm, a deviation from the island's perfect harmony. And as you observe your surroundings, you notice a pattern that would be easy to overlook. Fewer plants. The soft mosses and sky flowers that carpet large portions of the continent fade into sparse patches as you advance, as though nature itself respects the boundary just as strictly as the people do. It strikes you that the avoidance is not born of fear, not the immediate kind, at least. It feels more like a quiet reverence, the way one might instinctively lower their voice upon entering a sacred space. But there's also tension, subtle yet present, humming just under the surface. The inhabitants pretend it isn't there, not by denial but by routine. Their avoidance is natural, practiced, seamless. This only sharpens your sense of unease. Because in a society where everything is so peaceful, so perfectly orchestrated, the presence of something everyone refuses to acknowledge becomes impossible to ignore. The detail isn't loud or dramatic. It's the silence around it, the collective refusal to engage, the way the world seems to rearrange itself to hide it in plain sight. You stand at the threshold of this invisible boundary, a place where nothing looks wrong, yet everything feels wrong, and a quiet realization settles in. Whatever lies beyond this unmarked line is not a secret because it is hidden. It is a secret because it must never be disturbed. You stand just outside the invisible boundary, feeling the quiet air settle more heavily around you, when the first true sign reveals itself, not loudly, not through any sudden event, but in the tiniest details that most people would dismiss as coincidence. At the edge of a stone pillar carved by centuries of gentle wind, you notice a faint mark, so subtle it almost blends into the natural grain of the rock. It isn't writing, not in any traditional sense, but a symbol, a thin line crossed by a shorter diagonal slash, like a horizon bisected by a falling shadow. You brush your fingers over it, and the stone feels unchanged, worn smooth by time. But the moment your skin touches the symbol, the hum beneath your feet grows slightly louder, almost as if the island itself is acknowledging your curiosity. Your eyes begin to scan your surroundings, and suddenly these marks appear everywhere, not obvious, never prominent, always placed where they might be mistaken for imperfections. On the edges of homes, faintly etched near doorways, on the floating platforms that bridge one cliff to another, even on the woven trays at the market, carved into the underside where only the maker would see. Each symbol is small, always the same shape, always facing the same general direction, toward the area everyone avoids. You begin to realize these are not decorations or old carvings worn into meaninglessness. They are warnings, quiet, universal, understood by every inhabitant from birth, a shared language of caution. You watch a man closing his stall at the market, and as he folds a cloth, you notice the fabric bears a similar mark, stitched discreetly into a corner, hidden from customers. Children tossing glowing fruit between them pause for a moment as one of the fruits rolls toward the forbidden zone. Without speaking, they all freeze. One child retrieves it hesitantly, eyes lowered, and when he walks back to the group, they continue playing, but farther away. It's the way the adults subtly redirect the kids, the way conversations soften whenever bodies shift too near that direction. These aren't the actions of people afraid of a monster or a legend. This is ritual, conditioning, a cultural reflex so deeply ingrained that it needs no explanation. You catch the eye of an older inhabitant, an elderly woman with silver hair tied in soft loops that sway in the breeze. She watches you for a moment, her face calm, her expression unreadable, and then she gives the slightest shake of her head. Not a hard no, not a warning meant to frighten, just a gentle gesture, as if she were reminding a visitor not to step on a delicate flower. As she turns away, the wind lifts a piece of cloth draped over her arm, revealing embroidery along the hem. You recognize the symbol again, but this time it's repeated in a pattern, forming a looping chain that circles the fabric. The closer you look, the more intentional it becomes. Each link of the pattern is a variation on the same theme, lines intersecting, shapes angled like falling shadows, all pointing toward the same truth that no one speaks. You start to realize that people don't ignore this area out of superstition. Their restraint is practiced, precise, almost mathematical. Every structure, every path, every routine has been designed to avoid creating too much motion, too much interference, too much imbalance, and suddenly the hushed behavior around you feels even heavier, not fearful, but respectful, like a community collectively protecting something fragile, essential, and dangerously easy to disrupt. You look again at the forbidden region, and though it appears no different from the rest of the continent, you feel an unmistakable shift in your chest, a sense that whatever lies at its center is not simply part of the island. It is the reason the island exists at all. The symbols around you are not decoration, they are reminders. The whispers in the wind are not warnings, they are instructions. And though the inhabitants never speak the rule aloud, you're beginning to understand the truth. Everyone here knows exactly what must never happen. As you step even closer to the avoided region, the ground beneath you begins to change in a way that is almost imperceptible at first. Just a faint shift in pressure, a softness where stone should be firm. You pause, testing your weight, and notice that the surface seems to lower by a fraction of an inch, then rise again as if inhaling and exhaling beneath you. The rhythm is slow, gentle, not enough to startle, but enough to make you question whether the land itself is alive. You kneel, placing your hand on the smooth stone, and the vibration becomes more apparent, not a trembling, but a low, steady pulse that spreads through your fingertips and into your arm, like the thrum of an enormous heart buried deep within the floating mass. The sensation is strangely organic, yet undeniably mechanical, a blend of natural force and structural tension held in perfect equilibrium. When you stand, a subtle dizziness washes over you, as though gravity has momentarily loosened its grip. You lean forward instinctively, expecting to fall, but instead you find yourself almost suspended, balanced by invisible currents rising from below. It's not weightlessness, just a gentler version of weight, as if the island is compensating for your presence, adjusting itself to accommodate the shift. You test it again, lifting your foot slightly, and watch as a small piece of dust drifts upward before settling back down in a slow spiral. In any other world, dust falls with a simple inevitability. Here, it hesitates, reconsidering its path, moving in ways that defy intuition. As you walk, your steps create faint ripples across the stone, spreading out in soft waves that dissipate before reaching the edges of the path. These gentle distortions are not cracks or signs of damage. They're more like the surface of water responding to a pebble, except the ground is solid, unmoving. You look around and notice how the inhabitants navigate this area with unconscious expertise. Their strides shorten, their steps lighten, their bodies instinctively leaning into the micro-shifts of gravity, as though this is simply the way the world works. Even the floating platforms that connect distant cliffs adjust their position ever so slightly, tilting with the movements of those who cross them, as if compensating for each footstep. You realize then that the continent is not floating by accident. It is floating because every part of it cooperates with the forces holding it aloft. The air currents below, the stone's composition, the strange, luminous energy that permeates the sky, they are all working together in a delicate dance. And like any dance, one misstep could disrupt the rhythm. The closer you get to the center of the avoided zone, the stronger the pulse becomes, not louder, but more present, more insistent. It hums through your bones, a deep, resonant vibration that seems to come from somewhere impossibly far below. You strain to listen, and for a moment you think you can hear something beneath the hum, a faint metallic resonance, like the echo of a chime struck from within the core of the island. The gravity here is not unstable in the sense of failure, it's unstable in the sense of attention. It reacts, it adapts, it anticipates. The very ground seems aware of every shift in balance, every wave of movement, every tiny disruption. The world around you becomes subtly distorted, not visually but physically. When you turn your head quickly, you feel a slight lag, as if your body moves a fraction of a second slower than your thoughts. When you stretch out your hand, the air feels thicker, more resistant, like moving through a warm fog. And yet, despite the oddness, there is no sense of danger, at least not immediate danger. This instability is controlled, regulated by forces you cannot see, but even controlled instability is still instability. You begin to understand why the inhabitants avoid this region, why their movements are quiet, balanced, calculated. This is not a place where you run or shout or make sudden decisions. This is a place where the world breathes beneath your feet and where one wrong motion might make it breathe differently. Long before the floating continent became a home, a sanctuary, and a civilization built on balance and quiet discipline, it was nothing but a myth whispered among early skywatchers. Stories about strange atmospheric anomalies that appeared high above the world, shimmering like mirages suspended between earth and heavens. According to the oldest oral traditions, there was a time when explorers noticed clusters of clouds behaving unnaturally, gathering into dense, spiraling masses that would not disperse even under the strongest winds. These were called sky knots, places where the air twisted itself into patterns too complex for the naked eye to understand. Most dismissed them as oddities, temporary disturbances caused by storms. But a few believed these knots were evidence of an ancient force woven into the atmosphere itself, something capable of shaping the sky the way tectonic plates shape the ground. The earliest known account describes a massive storm system that lasted for months, never releasing rain, never producing lightning, only circling endlessly in the upper atmosphere as if drawing strength from something unseen. When it finally dissipated, what remained was not destruction, but a phenomenon unlike anything recorded. A massive coil of wind currents, spinning upward instead of outward, stabilizing into a column of rising air with enough force to lift dust, stones, and fragments of earth from the ground below. Over generations, this upward draft grew stronger, accumulating minerals and debris, reshaping them under extreme atmospheric pressure until they fused into a single massive structure. Layer by layer, the world above was forming. Slowly, quietly, without intervention. Scientists centuries later would name this process vertical aggregation, but to the early witnesses it was something divine, a miracle unfolding in slow motion across lifetimes. They watched continents being shaped on the ground. Now they watched one forming in the sky. As the column strengthened, more material was drawn upward, soil, rock, remnants of ancient cliffs, compressed and sculpted by atmospheric forces too powerful to comprehend. The floating mass grew so large that it began to cast a faint shadow on the land far below, bewildering farmers who could not understand why their fields darkened on cloudless days. Eventually, the upward force reached a point of equilibrium, where the pull of the sky balanced perfectly with the weight of the growing landmass. The result was astonishing. A stable island suspended miles above the world, held aloft by currents so finely tuned that even small disturbances had to be absorbed and redirected. Early explorers who reached the sky continent found a place that felt untouched by time. A vast plateau of smooth stone, warm underfoot from constant friction with the rising currents. They reported an eerie stillness, a humming resonance that vibrated through the air and into their chests. The first settlers arrived cautiously, building small shelters near the edges, testing how much weight the island could support, learning the rhythm of the breathing ground. It didn't take long to discover that the land responded to movement, shifting subtly but consistently. If too many variables changed at once, too much mass in the wrong place, too much shade cast over certain areas, too abrupt a disturbance, the hum would change, rising in pitch like a warning tone, and each time it did, the settlers recorded slight dips in elevation, tremors, pressure shifts. Something at the center was holding everything together, a point of balance where the ascending and descending currents met in perfect harmony. They called it the sustaining core, though it was not a physical object, but a phenomenon, a vertical beam of concentrated light and heated air that stabilized the island's position. It was powerful, precise, and extremely sensitive. The settlers learned, through tragedy and careful observation, that shadows falling across this core disrupted the delicate dance of forces. Even something as small as a drifting tarp or a misplaced piece of construction could alter the balance. And so, over generations, a rule formed, not written, not enforced, but inherited like instinct. Nothing must ever interrupt the light that fed the sustaining core. No tall structures, no careless movements, no casting of shadows over the heart of the island. This rule became a quiet foundation of their society, shaping architecture, culture, rituals, even daily footsteps. As the floating continent evolved into a thriving civilization, the people never forgot the origin of their home, a miracle created not by gods or magic, but by the sky itself, beautiful, powerful, and dangerously easy to destabilize. They built their world around that truth. They survived because they respected it. And even now, centuries later, the island still thrums with that ancient pulse, reminding everyone who walks upon it that their lives depend on a balance older than history and more fragile than anyone dares to admit. Life on the floating continent did not grow in the chaotic trial and error fashion of most civilizations. Here, everything from architecture to social hierarchy, from trade routes to childhood education, was shaped by the single invisible law that had carried them through generations. Over time, the inhabitants learned that survival depended not on strength or expansion, but on equilibrium, and so their world evolved like a perfectly tuned instrument, one designed to avoid even the slightest disruption to the sustaining core. The first thing you notice as you observe their society more closely is how every structure seems to lean away from the center of the continent. Homes curve downward toward the cliffs, pathways arc gently around unseen lines radiating outward from the core. Towers rise only to a certain height before bending or splitting into multiple smaller structures that distribute weight evenly. Taller constructions, like observation posts or communal halls, are always positioned beneath natural light openings in the atmosphere, where the ambient illumination cannot create shadows in forbidden directions. Entire districts are designed like petals of a flower, arranged symmetrically so that no single area blocks light from reaching the sustaining core. Markets, schools, gardens, they all conform to this silent choreography. Even the floating platforms used for transportation follow predetermined routes that avoid casting moving shadows across sensitive areas. You watch as a group of engineers inspect one of these platforms. They move with meticulous care, taking slow steps, adjusting their weight as if they can feel the flow of gravity and countercurrents beneath them. At one point, one of the engineers notices a platform drifting a few inches too close to the center. Without a word, she reaches up and adjusts a reflective panel on a nearby cliff. Immediately, the platform shifts direction, guided by redirected light and wind. No one claps, no one congratulates her. This is ordinary maintenance, part of their daily rhythm. Every role in society ties back to the rule. The gardeners who cultivate luminous plants along the cliffs are not simply beautifying the continent, they are ensuring that the mosses and flowers catch and refract light in ways that strengthen airflow around the sustaining core. The merchants who design fabrics incorporate patterns that subtly remind people which direction to avoid. Even the cooks, preparing meals on heated stone slabs, position their stations so the steam rises harmlessly away from the sensitive zone. Children learn the rule long before they understand the world. Their games are designed around balance, stepping stone paths that teach careful placement of weight. Floating hoops they must guide through the sky using only the wind. Shadow dances where they learn how light interacts with moving bodies. Nothing is harsh or oppressive. There is no fear-mongering, no strict punishments. The rule is not taught as a threat. It is taught as a truth, an unshakable fact of existence. And because of that, the people embrace it with a natural simplicity, accepting the boundaries the way someone on Earth accepts the need to breathe. Cultural rituals also reflect this devotion to equilibrium. At dawn, the inhabitants stand facing the direction of the sustaining core, bowing their heads in silence, not praying but acknowledging the balance that holds them aloft. At night, soft lights are arranged in patterns that imitate the ancient symbols you've seen etched around the continent, reinforcing the idea of interconnectedness. Communication between districts is managed by officials known as wind stewards, individuals trained to maintain airflow patterns, redirect floating debris, and ensure that weather changes from the world below do not destabilize the island. Their job is part meteorology, part philosophy, part choreography. Everything they do is designed to preserve harmony, because harmony is what keeps them alive. Even governance itself follows this principle. Leaders are chosen not through elections or inheritance, but through the test of stillness, a ritual in which candidates must stand on a platform near the core for hours at a time, adjusting their breathing and stance to sync with the island's pulse. Those who exhibit the greatest sensitivity to the island's micro-shifts, those who can sense danger before it fully emerges, are selected as guides for the community. And through all this order, all this structure built around an unwritten law, what strikes you most is the complete absence of rebellion or resistance, not because the people are oppressed, but because their survival has always been intertwined with cooperation. They don't obey the rule out of fear. They obey it because every life, every step, every breath on this continent is part of a system balanced so delicately that even one moment of ignorance could undo centuries of peace. Their society is not built around ambition or conquest, it is built around awareness. And standing there watching the careful dance of everyday life unfold, you realize something profound. These people are not merely inhabitants of the floating continent, they are custodians of the sky, guardians of a fragile miracle held together by trust, discipline, and a law that none of them would ever dare break. History on the floating continent is not recorded in thick books or carved into monuments. Instead, it lingers in whispered conversations, in the tense silence that falls when elders speak of the early days, in the small scars etched into the edges of cliffs where stone once cracked under strain. The people here do not hide their past, yet they do not dwell on it either. Their stories are passed down like warnings wrapped in velvet, gentle but firm, reminders of what happens when the delicate balance of their world is ignored. You begin to piece together these fragments slowly. A craftsman polishing a metal instrument mentions the shadow season in passing. A child, pointing to a distant ridge, says, "That part used to be closer." An elderly woman, sewing symbols into a cloth, murmurs, "We learned the hard way." No one gives full details, but the mosaic forms one shard at a time. Long ago, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer, there were incidents where the rule was not followed, not broken maliciously, not rebelled against, but simply overlooked. The earliest records describe a time when settlers underestimated the sensitivity of the sustaining core and built tall structures near the center, believing they were safe because no immediate consequences appeared. But as the buildings grew, shadows stretched over the heart of the island during certain hours of the day. At first, nothing happened. Then one quiet morning, the island gave a warning, an enormous groan that echoed across the sky like the cry of a mountain shifting. The ground tilted by a fraction of a degree, enough to make water pools slide toward the edges and small objects drift unnaturally upward. Birds that lived along the cliffs scattered in chaotic spirals. Settlers reported feeling a pressure in their chests, as if the air itself had tightened around them. When the sun moved and the shadows receded, the island stabilized. But the message was undeniable. The balance had been disturbed. The settlers destroyed the structures immediately, tearing them down stone by stone. They thought they had corrected the mistake, but the island remembered. A generation later, a careless shipment of reflective materials left near the center caused a different kind of disruption. Light refracted from the polished surfaces, scattering beams that danced unpredictably across the core. The result was catastrophic. One evening, without warning, the entire continent dropped several meters in a single instant. Houses shuddered, cliffs cracked, and large sections of stone sheared off the underside, falling silently into the ocean of clouds below. People were thrown off their feet. The hum of the island rose into a screeching vibration that pierced the air. Then, as suddenly as it had fallen, the continent stabilized again, but smaller, lighter, damaged. Those who lived near the fracture zones claimed that the wind changed its voice that night, carrying a note of grief. After that incident, something shifted in the culture. The stories became less frequent but more serious. The warnings more symbolic, yet more deeply ingrained. Some accounts speak of a night when the island's pulse stopped entirely, when all lights dimmed, when gravity loosened, when the air grew cold. For 10 breaths, the world held still, suspended in uncertainty before the core reignited with a blast of heat and light strong enough to scorch the central stones. The marks from that night still remain faintly visible, though the inhabitants avoid getting close enough to show them to you. Other tales describe strange distortions in the wind, air bending sharply as if reacting to an unseen force, carrying dust and debris into spirals that did not match any natural weather pattern. People disappeared in those moments, not dropped into the clouds, but simply erased, taken by the sudden collapse of microcurrents that supported pathways or platforms. Those stories are told quietly, their endings never fully explained. One elder tells you a final fragment. The island warns before it punishes, but it never warns twice. It becomes clear that the consequences of disobedience were not merely physical, they were emotional, shaping the collective psyche of everyone who lives here. This is why their steps are measured, why their voices are soft, why their homes bend away from the center and their routines flow like rivers around the forbidden zone. They are not living in fear, but in remembrance. Their history taught them that the rule is not a suggestion. It is the axis on which their entire world balances. And so their culture evolved not to challenge the rule, but to honor it, because the sky does not forgive ignorance, and the island does not forget imbalance. The more time you spend near the restricted region, the more you begin to understand that nothing about the floating continent is magical or accidental. Its stability is not a gift of the heavens, nor the result of ancient rituals. It is a mechanism, a vast and incredibly delicate system of natural forces interacting in a way so precise it borders on the improbable. The sustaining core that anchors the island in the sky is not a solid structure, nor a beam of mystic energy. It is a convergence point of atmospheric currents, layers of rising air, heat differentials, pressure zones, and the naturally occurring phenomenon known as vertical aggregation, all woven together into a single upward force strong enough to support the mass of an entire continent. Scientists who dedicated their lives to studying this point describe it as a column of structured turbulence, though even that term fails to capture its complexity. Imagine a tornado turned inside out, its energy directed not downward, but upward in a perfectly balanced stream. Now imagine that this stream does not rotate chaotically, but flows with the steadiness of a candle flame protected from the wind. The core is that flame, always rising, always pushing, always lifting. But unlike a flame, it survives only if uninterrupted. The light you see on the continent is not simply illumination. It is an essential component of the system. The atmosphere absorbs sunlight, redistributes it across the sky continent, and feeds thermal differences that sustain the upward draft. Without light, the air cools. When the air cools, the currents weaken. When the currents weaken, the island drops. Only a few centimeters, perhaps, but that is enough to trigger further destabilization. It becomes obvious why shadows matter. Light is the lifeblood of the sustaining core. Shadows are interruptions. A large shadow over the center can instantly cool a section of the air column, creating a collapse in the upward pressure, like a sudden knot forming in a flow of water. And because the currents operate in perfect equilibrium, even a slight disruption can ripple outward with dangerous consequences. Scientists describe these intermediate reactions as micro-failures, zones where the air loses lift for fractions of a second, causing the ground above to tilt or vibrate. If these micro-failures occur repeatedly, they amplify into macro shifts, altering the platform's balance. That is when tremors happen. That is when cliffs crack. That is when the island remembers the catastrophes of its past. The sustaining core is also incredibly sensitive to mass distribution. Place too much weight near the center, and the system tries to compensate by increasing its upward force. But this surge destabilizes adjacent layers, creating turbulence. The inhabitants know this intimately. They arrange their architecture so that the heaviest structures are far from the center. They distribute population evenly across districts. They build storage areas near the outer cliffs. Nothing tall, nothing dense, nothing that casts a wide shadow ever rises close to the heart of the continent. You learn that there is even an entire scientific discipline devoted to monitoring the equilibrium, aerolith dynamics, the study of airborne landmasses and the flows that sustain them. Its practitioners track wind patterns, thermal pockets, gravitational fluctuations, even the weight of rainstorms that pass through the sky at lower altitudes. They can predict when the island will dip several centimeters and take preemptive measures to counteract it. One aerolith scholar explains it to you with quiet reverence. He points to a spinning diagram etched into a stone table. Spiraling currents, stacked layers, lines of airflow converging into a single upward thrust. It's not just science, he says softly. It's balance. Absolute balance. If you interrupt one link in the chain, the others overcompensate. And overcompensation is far more dangerous than failure. You realize that the sustaining core is not only sensitive to shadow, but to sound, temperature, humidity, and even vibration. Too loud a shout, too sudden a motion, too concentrated a crowd, all have the potential to introduce small fluctuations into the system. And so the people here speak softly, move carefully, and distribute themselves naturally in patterns that avoid overstressing the invisible forces beneath their feet. The brilliance of this society is that they do not treat the sustaining core as a threat to be feared or a mystery to be worshipped. They treat it as a partner, a living force that supports them as long as they respect its needs. Their entire world, their homes, their rituals, their science, their daily habits is an elaborate agreement with the sky, a pact to maintain the delicate physics that hold them aloft. And the more you understand this system, the more the rule makes perfect sense. It is not superstition. It is engineering. It is survival. It is the one truth that every inhabitant carries in their bones. Nothing must ever interrupt the light that feeds the core, because the sky may lift them, but it will not save them if they let the balance break. As you walk toward the region everyone avoids, the world around you begins to shift in ways that are subtle yet unmistakable. It starts with the light. The floating continent, normally bathed in a soft, omnidirectional glow, seems to dim by the faintest margin, as though the sky itself hesitates to illuminate this place too brightly. Colors that once seemed vibrant now appear muted. Blues fading into grey, greens turning dusky and pale, even the warm golden tones of the stone underfoot becoming cooler, more restrained. It is not darkness, not even close. It is more like the light is being filtered through a delicate veil that you cannot see. The air grows cooler as well, not sharply so, but enough for you to notice the difference on your skin. It brushes against your arms like a thin ribbon of mountain air, clean but unnervingly still. The ever-present hum of the continent, the living vibration you've grown accustomed to, changes pitch, flattening into something calm but wary, as if the island is holding its breath. You take another step, and the sound around you shifts again. Normally, the island carries a serene quiet, broken only by the soft murmur of wind or distant footfalls. Here, however, the silence deepens until it becomes a presence of its own, thick enough to make you swallow without realizing it. Your footsteps, usually absorbed by the stone, echo faintly, a soft, hollow resonance that feels out of place. You test the sound by stepping lightly and notice the echo disappears. It only emerges when you step with more weight, almost as if the ground is reacting, measuring your presence. When you pause, listening, you realize that even the wind behaves differently here. It does not whip or swirl or dance, but glides in tight, disciplined currents that seem to bend around an invisible boundary. The breeze that once caressed your skin now moves past you with structured precision, like a river following the strict path of carved stone. And then you notice something even stranger, the sound of your breath. It seems louder here, sharper, clearer, as though the air carries each exhale farther than it should. You try whispering, and the sound travels with a faint metallic resonance, bouncing softly against the invisible structure beneath the ground. When you look into the distance, the landscape appears normal, perhaps too normal. The stone is the same smooth texture, the same pale gold, yet there is a sense of unnatural perfection. No cracks, no plants, no wandering animals, no footprints. It is as if nature itself refuses to touch this place. You step forward again, and a tingling spreads through your legs, a gentle static that climbs upward. It doesn't hurt, but it makes your muscles tense involuntarily, as though your body is instinctively resisting the direction you're moving. You take another step, and the ground dips slightly, so slightly that you wouldn't have noticed if the rest of the continent hadn't been so flawlessly stable. It feels almost like stepping onto a soft surface, except the stone remains rigid beneath you. The dip is internal, a shift in pressure rather than structure. You stretch your hand toward the air ahead of you, and something unexpected happens. The air thickens, not visibly but physically, pressing lightly against your palm. It feels like moving through a heavy mist or warm water, yet the space before you is perfectly clear. When you withdraw your hand, the sensation fades immediately. You realize then that this place is not visually marked because it doesn't need to be. The continent itself creates the barrier, an organic atmospheric threshold built by the forces that sustain the island. As you look toward the heart of the forbidden region, you feel an instinctive pull in your chest, not emotional but physical, like gravity itself is subtly stronger here. Your balance shifts as you take a hesitant step forward, and the hum beneath the ground rises. Not a warning, but a reminder. Behind you, life continues on the continent's safer edges. Markets, families, terraces, music carried softly on the wind. But here, everything feels suspended. Time seems to stretch, your heartbeat sinking with the island's pulse. The horizon warps slightly, not enough to distort your vision, but enough for your brain to sense something unusual in the distance. You feel watched, not by eyes, but by the island itself, by the system of currents and energies that sense every motion, every imbalance. And it's in this moment, standing at the very threshold of the place no one dares to enter, that you finally understand the truth. This is not just a forbidden zone. This is the center of everything, the birthplace of the rule, the heart of the sky. And you, unlike the inhabitants, are about to step where no one should. You stand at the edge of the forbidden zone, the air thick around you like invisible velvet, when the truth finally strikes, not in a dramatic flash, nor in some booming revelation, but in a gentle, almost sorrowful clarity. You begin to understand the rule, not because someone tells you, but because your body feels it before your mind fully grasps it. You take one careful step forward, and the light around you shifts. Subtly, but unmistakably. It bends, thinning in front of you, scattering behind you. The hum beneath the stone rises, trembling softly like a held breath. And suddenly, it clicks. Your shadow is stretching toward the center of the continent. It's thin and faint, almost non-existent in this diffused world of ambient glow. But it's there, a small disturbance in the perfectly balanced illumination that blankets the sustaining core. You freeze. The air around your hand thickens again, but now you recognize it for what it truly is. Resistance, not a barrier meant to stop you, but a final buffer designed to slow the creation of shadows, a natural defense the island uses to protect itself. You step back, and the hum softens instantly. Your faint shadow retracts, dissolving into the golden light. And in that moment, the rule becomes painfully clear. Written not in words but in physics, in the living breath of the island. No one, no person, no object, no structure can cast a shadow over the sustaining core. The realization spreads through you like warm light. It feels simple, almost too simple. How could something as ordinary as a shadow threaten an entire continent? But you remember everything you've learned, how the island relies on constant illumination, how the sustaining core is fed by uninterrupted thermal and photonic energy, how even slight fluctuations in light can destabilize its delicate equilibrium. A shadow is not just the absence of light, it is an interruption of heat, a disruption of airflow, a disturbance in the upward currents. A shadow is a tiny cold front. A shadow is imbalance. The people here know this intuitively. They do not avoid the center out of mysticism. They avoid it because even the smallest shadow cast in the wrong place could ripple outward into catastrophic consequences. You begin to see it everywhere, the gentle curve of buildings, all sloping away from the core to ensure their silhouettes fall safely outward. The reflective surfaces embedded into the cliffs, redirecting light upward. The patterns stitched into fabrics, reminding their wearers where their bodies should never face. Even the floating platforms are carefully angled to prevent shadows from drifting across the core as they move. You lift your hand again, not to test the air, but to observe the faint outline of your silhouette diffused into the soft glow. And you realize the brilliance of the rule. No one needs to enforce it because the sky itself enforces it. The light here is omnidirectional, deliberately diffused by centuries of natural adaptation. It makes shadows rare, faint, almost impossible to produce unless someone directly approaches the forbidden zone, which is exactly why the inhabitants never approach it. This is not superstition. It is survival disguised as cultural instinct. You realize that the symbols etched across the island are not warnings, but reminders. Thin lines showing how even the smallest change in angle can redirect a shadow. Diagonal slashes demonstrating how light must continue unbroken. Patterns representing the flow of illumination around the sustaining core. And suddenly, the island seems less like a miracle and more like a living equation. A system designed to remain stable only as long as the rule is respected. You look toward the heart of the forbidden zone, and though the sustaining core is invisible to the naked eye, you can feel it. An intense upward pressure, a column of ascending energy, a weightless gravity pushing endlessly toward the sky. Your shadow, faint as it is, drifts slightly forward again, as you shift your footing, and the hum spikes, vibrating through the air like a whispered plea. You step back once more, and the tension dissolves. The island's pulse steadies. Its breath becomes calm again, and you understand in full what the inhabitants have always known. The greatest danger to this world is not storms, or weight, or weather. It is the simple, careless moment when light is blocked from reaching its heart. A world sustained by illumination can be undone by darkness. A floating continent can fall because of a shadow. And now that you know the rule, you finally understand why no one, ever, dares to break it. Once the rule becomes clear, its importance settles into you with a weight far heavier than the air around the sustaining core. It is not simply a matter of brightness or shadow, of superstition or tradition. It is the difference between survival and collapse, between a world held aloft and a world plunging into the abyss below. You begin to understand that the floating continent exists in a perpetual state of negotiation with the sky. The sustaining core is not a static miracle, but a dynamic equilibrium, a constant interplay of rising heat, structured air currents, and perfectly distributed illumination. Every second of every day, millions of micro-adjustments happen within the atmosphere beneath the island. Currents shifting, pressure zones oscillating, temperatures balancing in a dance so complicated it would take centuries of study to fully comprehend. The inhabitants do not need to understand the science in detail. They have learned through generations of experience that interruptions to the core are not gradual. They are immediate. A shadow that passes over the core is not a small disturbance. It is a sudden, localized cooling of the air column that supports the entire mass of the continent. Even a few degrees of lost heat can cause the uplift to weaken just enough to throw the system off balance. And because the entire island depends on upward pressure, the consequences cascade instantly. First comes the subtle dip, just centimeters, maybe less, but it's enough for the island's center of gravity to shift. The hum beneath the stone rises, its tone sharpening like a warning bell. Then the air currents attempt to compensate, rushing to fill the deficit of heat. But compensation is chaotic by nature. When one layer of the atmosphere adjusts, adjacent layers respond, creating ripples of turbulence that radiate outward in unpredictable patterns. These turbulent ripples strike the underside of the island, causing micro-vibrations that spread across the ground like invisible waves. What begins as a tiny imbalance becomes a destabilizing force. The island tilts fractionally, and that tilt redistributes weight. More mass shifts toward one side, and suddenly the core is supporting an uneven load, forcing the currents to adapt yet again. Each adaptation creates more turbulence, more shifts, more instability. Now imagine this chain reaction happening in less than a second. Imagine an entire world responding instantly to a momentary shadow. The downward lurch would be small at first, barely noticeable to someone on the outer cliffs, but those who live near the center would feel the drop like a caught breath, a sudden heaviness pulling at their bodies. The oldest stories speak of this exact sensation, a moment when people felt the air thicken, the sky tighten, their stomachs lift as the ground beneath them faltered, and then the real danger begins. As the uplift weakens, even for an instant, the underside of the island scrapes against denser pockets of air, creating friction that heats the stone and intensifies the hum. The core tries to reignite its full strength, drawing more thermal energy upward, but the instability it creates can cause sudden surges of force that destabilize outer layers. These surges manifest as tremors, vertical jerks, cracks in the cliffs. Structures tilt, walkways shift, floating platforms lurch unpredictably. And if the imbalance continues, if the shadow lingers even a second too long, the core can collapse for a moment, just a moment. But a moment is enough. The island can drop several meters in a single gasp, tearing apart foundation stones, breaking platforms, destroying cliff edges. People near the center vanish, not because they fall, but because the air currents beneath them collapse so violently that they are swallowed by a downward vortex. And even if the core restabilizes, the damage remains. The stories passed down through generations are not exaggerations. They are memories etched into the culture, reminders of calamities that nearly ended the floating world. A shadow, an elder once said to you, is not darkness, it is interruption, and interruption is death. This is why nobody builds tall structures. This is why light is sacred. This is why the inhabitants speak softly, move deliberately, live with a constant awareness of their environment. They are not afraid of the core. They are responsible for it. Their entire existence depends on maintaining a balance so delicate it would seem impossible if you had not already felt its breath beneath your feet. Standing here now, with your shadow dissolving harmlessly in the ambient glow, you realize that the rule is not just important, it is absolute. A truth written into the physics of their world, a boundary that keeps a miracle alive. And the weight of that truth settles in your chest like gravity. The gravity of understanding just how close this world lives to the edge of collapse. The more time you spend among the inhabitants, the more clearly you see how this silent fear, this awareness of living above a fragile column of air and light, shapes every detail of their society, not as tension, but as discipline woven into the fabric of everyday life. It is a fear so constant and so inherited that it no longer feels like fear at all. It feels like instinct. The people here do not walk with urgency. Their steps are soft, deliberate, as if each movement is a small gesture of respect to the forces that keep their world afloat. Voices never rise above a gentle murmur. Laughter exists, of course, but it is light and breathy, carried on the wind like birdsong instead of bouncing loudly across stone. Even children, often the most impulsive members of any society, move with a natural awareness of their own shadows. You watch a group of them play a game near a sunlit terrace, guiding floating hoops through the air with rhythmic motions of their hands. Every now and then, a child stops to check the direction of the light, adjusting their position instinctively before continuing. No adult tells them to do this. They have learned from the environment itself, from the way the wind shifts, the way the ground hums beneath their feet, the way their parents' eyes drift toward the horizon whenever clouds begin to gather. The architecture reinforces this quiet vigilance. Houses are built with curved roofs that push their shadows outward, away from the core. Walkways curve instead of cutting straight lines across open spaces, guiding the flow of foot traffic in ways that minimize interference. Even interior spaces reflect this awareness. Windows positioned to catch and diffuse light in soft angles. Furniture placed not for convenience, but for balance. The floating continent is more than a place where they live. It is an organism they cooperate with. You notice how communal life revolves around light. At dawn, families gather outside their homes, facing the direction of the sustaining core, not to worship, but to synchronize their day with the natural rhythm of the island. They close their eyes, breathe deeply, and listen to the hum beneath the ground, adjusting their own breathing patterns to the pulse of the continent. At midday, when the ambient glow is strongest, people pause whatever they are doing, harvesting sky moss, carving stone instruments, maintaining wind-guiding structures, and simply stand still for a moment. It is a quiet ritual of acknowledgement, a daily reminder that the balance holding them aloft is still intact. When storms pass beneath the island, causing the clouds below to roil and churn, the inhabitants gather in communal halls built far from the core. These halls are designed to resonate with the island's hum, amplifying it so everyone can hear it clearly. The people sit together in silence, waiting for the pulse to steady again. When it does, they return to their lives with renewed gratitude, not celebrating survival, but honoring continuity. The fear of collapse is never spoken aloud, yet it shapes every aspect of life. Couples teach their children how to move like wind. Builders calculate shadow angles with precision. Merchants organize their stalls according to the path of the light at different hours. Farmers cultivate plants that enhance airflow rather than obstruct it. Even the positioning of simple items, baskets, tools, lanterns, is a mindful act. Nothing is placed carelessly. Nothing is allowed to disrupt the flow. But this silent fear does not make them grim or joyless. In fact, their society seems more content, more peaceful than most grounded civilizations you've known. Perhaps it is because they live with constant awareness of the fragility of life. Perhaps it is because the balance they maintain fosters a unity that other cultures struggle to achieve. When danger is ever present but predictable, when survival depends on cooperation rather than competition, people learn to trust one another without hesitation. Conflicts are rare, disagreements soft. Even their celebrations reflect this harmony. During the festival known as the Day of Still Air, the entire population gathers on the cliffs overlooking the sea of clouds. They light soft lanterns that drift upward slowly, each one a glowing symbol of gratitude for another year of balance. The lanterns never cross into the forbidden zone. The wind guides them safely outward, as if the sky itself participates in the ritual. And through it all, despite the quiet tension beneath their lives, the people of the floating continent do not consider themselves trapped by fear. Instead, they see themselves as custodians of a miracle, guardians of a world that exists only because they choose to live in harmony with forces they cannot control. Their fear has become wisdom, their vigilance a form of collective grace, their caution a language shared through generations. They do not fear the sky, they live with it. And in that fragile coexistence, they find something rare, not just survival, but serenity. It is only after spending enough time among these people, walking their curving paths, listening to their quiet voices, witnessing their instinctive rituals, that the true weight of their existence reveals itself to you. At first, you believed the rule was purely practical, a scientific necessity built to preserve the stability of a floating continent. But now, standing on a terrace overlooking the endless ocean of clouds, watching the inhabitants move through their day with a gentle unity you have never seen anywhere else, you realize the rule is much more than that. It is the foundation of a society anchored not just in physics, but in meaning. The rule has shaped them emotionally, spiritually, and socially, becoming the thread that binds every person to one another. They do not simply avoid casting shadows over the sustaining core, they avoid casting shadows over each other's lives. You see it in their eyes, in the softness with which they greet strangers, in the way they pause to help an elderly villager adjust their balance during a subtle shift in the wind. You see it in the way merchants rearrange their stalls with consideration for one another, making sure no one is pushed toward the forbidden zone, ensuring no child wandering too close feels alone or unseen. In a world where a careless gesture could cause catastrophe, kindness has become instinct. Empathy has become survival. The people here do not move gently because they fear the core. They move gently because they fear harming the delicate equilibrium that holds every life around them. This balance has shaped their culture into something extraordinary. There is no competition for power, no loud conflict, no ambition that comes at the expense of another. Leadership is not earned through dominance or wealth, but through sensitivity. Those who feel the island's shifts most deeply are those entrusted to guide others. Imagine a society where emotional awareness is not a skill, but a requirement for governance, where empathy is not optional, but essential. You speak with a teacher, an older man with soft eyes, who describes how children are raised on this continent. "We teach them to listen," he says, tapping the stone beneath your feet, not with their ears, but with their bodies, to feel the island, to feel each other. Balance is not a rule, it is who we are. In that moment you realize the sustaining core is not just a physical phenomenon, it has become a metaphor for existence. a living reminder that every life here is connected to the breath of the island, that their shared survival depends on shared awareness. The rule has become a cultural mirror. The people see themselves reflected in it, fragile, necessary, responsible. This is why their expressions carry a depth you cannot quite name. They live knowing their world does not hold itself together through permanence, but through constant cooperation. They live knowing that equilibrium must be maintained not only in the sky beneath their feet, but in the relationships they build every day. The emotional revelation comes to you slowly, like dawn spreading across the horizon. This society is suspended not only in the sky, but in a state of perpetual trust. Their unity is not enforced by law or fear. It is shaped by the shared understanding that every person's choices ripple outward, that a single careless moment could disrupt the lives of thousands, that their survival depends on each individual being mindful, present, aware. And so they have built a culture where mindfulness is not a trend, but a way of life, where calm is not a luxury, but a principle, where harmony is not a wish, but a necessity. You realize that the floating continent is more than a setting, it is an ideal, a symbol of what humanity could be if it lived with constant awareness of its impact on the world around it. The rule then is not merely a safeguard, it is a philosophy, a reminder that light, literal and metaphorical, must be allowed to flow freely, that shadows, whether cast by structures or by actions, must be understood for the consequences they create. And as you take a slow breath, feeling the gentle hum of the island fuse with your heartbeat, you understand that you have not simply visited a place, you have glimpsed a way of living, a society suspended not only above the clouds, but above the chaos that defines so many grounded worlds. It is a revelation that settles inside you quietly, shaping your understanding of balance forever. And when you finally turn away from the view, the world feels different. You feel different. Because now you know, the rule that holds their continent aloft is the same rule that holds their hearts together. As your time on the floating continent comes to an end, you find yourself standing once more at the cliff's edge, gazing into the endless expanse of clouds drifting far below. The sky around you glows with a pale, ethereal light, soft enough to calm every breath you take, yet bright enough to illuminate the truth you now understand. The world beneath you feels impossibly distant, almost mythical, as if you have lived your entire life suspended in this tranquil realm, and the ground is nothing more than a forgotten dream. The hum of the island thrums gently through your feet, steady and warm, pulsing with the same quiet rhythm that has guided the inhabitants for centuries. You inhale deeply, letting the cool air settle inside your chest, and as you exhale, you feel the gravity, both the literal and the emotional, of everything you have witnessed. You look out across the sweeping horizon, where the curves of the floating stone seem to merge seamlessly into the sky, and you understand that this world is beautiful, not because it defies physics, but because it lives in harmony with them. Here, balance is not an achievement, it is a constant effort, a perpetual dialogue between the island and the sky, between the people and the forces that hold them aloft. And you realize that there is something profoundly fragile about that harmony, something precious, something perilously easy to break. You glance toward the distant forbidden zone, now just a faint suggestion on the horizon. Even from here, you can sense the subtle shift in the air around it, the thinning of the light, the way the stone seems smoother, quieter, more reflective of the rule that governs everything. You could almost imagine the sustaining core breathing beneath it, invisible but unmistakably present, a silent guardian, a silent threat, a place where a single thoughtless shadow could weigh more than all the stone and air that hold this world together. And yet, standing here, you feel no fear, only awe. Awe at the resilience of the inhabitants, at their unwavering unity, at their instinctive respect for forces most civilizations ignore. Awe at the realization that this society has not survived because of the sky. It has survived because of its people, because they listen, because they understand the value of caution, of cooperation, of balance. You watch as a family walks along a distant path, their silhouettes tiny against the vastness of the continent. A child pauses, pointing excitedly at a drifting plume of cloud rising from below. The parents smile gently, adjusting their position so their shadows fall safely to the outer rim rather than toward the center. The movement is so natural, so effortless, that you feel a deep ache of admiration. This is what it looks like when a society truly understands interconnectedness, when the happiness of one is tied to the survival of all, when every step, every choice, every breath is part of a shared responsibility. As the clouds shift, you see golden beams scatter across the cliffs, painting the stone with a soft radiance that feels almost alive. The continent rises ever so slightly, just a few millimeters, responding to some distant thermal uplift, and you feel the ground lift beneath your feet, as if acknowledging your presence one last time. It is subtle enough that you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But now, after everything, you are paying attention. The wind brushes past you gently, carrying faint traces of voices from the markets below, blending them with the quiet hum of the island's pulse. The sounds melt together into something indescribably peaceful, a tone that feels like memory and discovery all at once. You realize slowly that you are leaving this world different than you arrived. You came as an observer, but you leave as someone who has learned the language of balance, someone who has felt the heartbeat of the sky, someone who understands that even the smallest shadow can change everything. As you step back from the cliff's edge and prepare to depart, the continent remains suspended behind you, serene, majestic, impossibly harmonious. It will continue to float, guided by forces both natural and collective, sustained by a rule so simple yet so absolute. You cast one final glance over your shoulder, watching the golden light ripple across the surface of the sky-bound land, and you feel a shiver, half wonder, half reverence, run down your spine. Because now you know the truth. This world survives not through strength, but through vigilance, not through dominance, but through cooperation, not through magic, but through the fragile, beautiful equilibrium that must never, ever be disturbed. And as you disappear back into the drifting clouds, the floating continent breathes beneath the sky, balanced on a single, eternal truth, a rule that no one is allowed to break.